things that are not pro-industry at this point, then we are just going to continue to have a period of lack of industrial growth that is going to ultimately feed into overall slower economic growth, overall slower tax collections, and thereby increase the fiscal deficit even further. So I think the crying need of the hour at this point in time clearly, Shweta, is to basically make sure that something is done to revive sentiment, to create a more facilitative environment to have more investments, and thereby really bring about a slight change in the overall depressed sentiment that exists right now. And there are quite a few things the government actually can do. And to be honest with you, a lot of it is just about taking decisions. And to me, the whole thing about this telecom debate that has been going on is in a way not so much the actual number, but in terms of the fact that they've actually taken a decision. And to me, that itself is a salutary thing. And I hope that going forward they take a number of other decisions, because look, any decision you take in India right now, there are going to be people who are going to scream that it was too bad, it was too high, some people are going to say it was too cheap. So you'll always have that point of view. The point really is, as long as you take decisions and move on, that is ultimately what is going to result in further clarity in the policy making environment, and that is ultimately going to lead to growth. If you look at the power sector, for example, there's so many things that need to be done. Not all of them are pleasant, but they actually need to be done. Somebody needs to bite the bullet. And so in fact, if the government just takes the view that, look, as long as we take the decisions and move forward, some people will always be unhappy about the decisions, whether it's the population or industry or opposition or CAG, whatever you might have. But the fact is they need to take decisions. And in that sense, just having taken the telecom decision to me is a big positive. And there's clearly a lot of things on the government's plate right now. Let's hope they just move forward.
I think it's a very, very valid point that Mr. Sumant Sinha has raised there, that while we continue to see the telecom industry unhappy about that number, the number is insignificant. Moving forward, we need to see the government acting fast, quickly, decisively, and at least the positive from today's decision is that we've got one policy uncertainty out of the way. Vivek Daheja, I know you have a point to make, and that's the question I was coming to you for. The fact that the government now needs to be sending the right message that it means business, it's going to act quickly, and there will be no more policy uncertainty. Vivek, is that a positive coming out of today's decision at least?
Shweta, absolutely, and I certainly echo the sentiment of your last speaker that the actual, one can argue the actual number debate should have been 14, 18, but the fact is they've made a decision and some people won't like it. And of course there was this difficult balancing act. I mean, obviously the industry would want the auction given away, as was the old system that the CAG has questioned and has struck down. And from the point of view of government revenue, they of course want to have a higher reserve price. So they had to strike a balance somewhere. And they have a number. It may not be the best number, but we shouldn't let sort of the perfect solution stop us from moving forward. So I think the key is that, as you raised in your question, is we've got to get out of this mode of paralysis, of rethinking, of thinking again, thinking 3 times, and just move forward on some basic initiatives. So I would certainly welcome this as a good step forward, Shweta.
But somebody has got to explain to me how setting a high reserve price and the final auction price marry. We keep on confusing the two, and I think this is where we need to say, listen, set a reasonable reserve price and let the auction process determine the final price.
Mr. Piyush Goyal of the BJP is also here with us. Go ahead, Mr. Goyal. I know you
Shweta, at the outset I agree with what Sumant and Vivek said.
Right.
That thank God that the government has started to take some decisions.
Right.
Though I'm not entirely sure whether this was a make or break decision for India.
But a make or break for telecom in a way that there was way too much uncertainty.
And I'm not even so sure it was a make or break for telecom, because I don't know whether 14 and 18, and as Mr. Matthews rightly said, it's only a reserve price. I don't know whether 14 or 18 is a game changer, point 1.
Right.
Point 2, I don't know whether TRAI is still on board on this, because I'm not sure if TRAI, Mr. Khullar is a very respected gentleman.
Absolutely.
He came into the public domain with his workings and he said it will have no impact. In that case, whether the government is empowered to go beyond the recommendations of TRAI is still a matter of
Are you saying they shouldn't have lowered it beyond the 18?
I don't know. I'm not so
because
sure.
Because the cabinet was empowered.
Would it not have been better if the cabinet had gone back to TRAI to explain their rationale, explain whether what Mr. Matthews and other people are saying is right or wrong, And then again, Mr. Matthews very rightly said it's only a reserve price. If they were so concerned about the reserve price, I suspect there could be more to it. Is there some kind of a cartelization or something that is in the offing, that you set the reserve price low and then you all decide that you take so much, I take so much, and we just settle the matter? I don't know, I'm not alleging anything at all. I'm just asking why the reserve price became such a big game changer.
That's what I said, you know, CAG and opposition, beware.
We've already
It's nothing to do with opposition. That's why I said I have no complaints about the reserve price going down.
So skeptical.
TRAI have had an opportunity to get into the act, and Mr. Khullar, I personally was quite convinced we should review this till before Mr. Khullar came out with his statement a week ago.
And we've already seen a case where we've got the Cellular Operators Association, Mr. Matthews, saying low but not low enough. We've got Dr. Subramaniam Swamy saying high but not high enough.
But in that case, the original 2G case itself rests on this premise. We have one minister who says, I took a decision. He even claims he took it along with the TRAI in consort. He claims I had the authority to override TRAI recommendation. So all of that gets justified now. There is no case probably.
Okay, a quick reaction from you to what Mr. Goyal is saying and from Mr. Uppal before we move on to the larger picture.
So clearly this whole issue again that we keep going back to reserve price, please look at international experience as well. All of the countries that have gotten this extraction, if you will, of large amounts upfront have invariably landed into trouble both from an exchequer point of view and from a industry point of view. So again, we don't seem to be learning from what is going on from these types of experiences. And the other point of view that I want to raise, Shweta, is that this narrow definition of revenue. Look at the impact that this industry has on overall GDP growth. You know, we know for a fact that a 10% increase in teledensity leads to at least a 1.4 increase in GDP. Why isn't that being taken into account in terms of factoring in the total revenue impact on the industry? Now, previously, 2001, to his credit, Mr. Vajpayee made a very bold decision. At that point, he basically stepped in. Similar charges were being made, by the way, and he basically said, I'm taking a decision to go to revenue share. And in hindsight, the government has made more as a result, and the country has developed more.
I had a suggestion. Why did they not do an auction of the revenue share, like the airports?
Okay, Mr. Sumant Sinha, my question to you here is that while we keep discussing this issue, and again we're not discussing telecom specific here, but a larger issue of, and this is a question that comes up with various industries, the government's aim of revenue maximization versus the benefit to the industry. What should really take precedence? Because it's always a tough question that comes up before the government. On one hand, you say, okay, maximize revenue for the government because the government at this stage is in need of that revenue, and that is something the government ought to do. At the same time, if it is harming the industry, should you give up your revenue maximization goal for the sake of the industry?
So I think what the government should really keep as its defining objective here really is basically to maximize the growth for the country in the long term on a sustainable basis. Clearly, if setting a high revenue maximization goal in the short term ends up harming that, then clearly the government should not do that and therefore move into issues like revenue share and so on. So I think clearly speaking, the fact of the matter is that you know, as one of the speakers earlier was pointing out, industrial growth in different sectors does have an impact on growth, GDP growth in the longer term, because there's so many tertiary and secondary impacts on the economy. I mean, look at the power sector, for example. I come back to that just because it's been very topical recently. I think if investments in the power sector take off, the government, the government does look at, for example, No, unfortunately that is the case, because for the last 7-8 years we've been basically not investing in that sector at all, and you know, it's really got to a point where the infrastructure is now creaking and we don't really have coal supplies available. So I think again, if you look at, for example, the auction of coal blocks, you can try to maximize revenue from there in the short term. That will obviously be, from a transparency standpoint, probably better. It will lead to perhaps less objections from people like the CAG and various political participants. But at the same time, if you keep a very high price or just don't do it at all, in that case you will not have additions of power sector capacity. and that is ultimately going to harm the economy in the long run. So I would say in the short term, it is just better to just keep things moving. You know, it doesn't matter to some extent whether you leave some money on the table if X makes it or Y makes it. And I know I'll be accused of things like crony capitalism and so on. But ultimately the fact of the matter is there is a beneficial impact if industrial growth does happen, tax collections do take place.
You know, Sweta, just talking about keeping the country moving. A couple of days ago, the whole Northeast grid shut down. You know, the only thing that worked is your cell phone.
And I know you also, and I know the crisis became an opportunity for the Cellular Operators Association because they actually put out a release saying that the mobile infrastructure will be next.
Yeah.
If you don't allow investments
exactly.
in telecom.
So we're saying is that, you know, our industry stepped in there and everybody was tailing.
I'm interested in knowing how he reacts to the auction of the revenue share.
Okay.
What would you feel about that?
You know, ultimately, we would love to be able to consider what that entails in terms of the revenue stream. I think part of what we are concerned about is that you keep taking so many bites out of the apple. You maximize quote-unquote the revenue. Then you come after us for 8% of our AGR for license fee. Then you come after us for a slab hit on the same AGR for what? Spectrum. I'm paying market price. So where is this going to end?
Alright, like I've been talking, there's a different backdrop in which we're seeing all these telecom decisions take place. The backdrop of the huge scandals, the corruption charges, the 2G scam, so to say, which is why we're not going to see the government being too empathetic to the telecom industry particularly. That's something that the industry probably has to understand. There's a political backdrop to these decisions. But Mr. Mahesh Uppal, now let's move forward and talk about the fact that we've got a new man in charge. Mr. Chidambaram has taken over as the finance minister of the country, and there are huge expectations riding that things are going to change. As a telecom expert, what is your advice to India's new finance minister?
Well, my advice to him would be that please don't kill the golden goose. By all means, you have legitimate expectations of revenue from this sector, but don't insist on getting it in one fell swoop. Make sure that you have a sufficiently healthy industry which can deliver this kind of the kind of revenues you need over a longer period in a sustainable fashion. I think what is currently being attempted, almost everybody across the board agrees, is a very, very knee-jerk reaction to an entirely different set of problems. And I think this kind of an approach to a very key input of the sector, i.e. spectrum, is actually hugely distorting for a whole lot of other services that will take place. Remember, the same spectrum or the same wireless is going to be our key method of expanding broadband networks, where we are a laggard in the world. Now, if we make investments more difficult to make or less attractive, then we are hurting some larger and more longer-term goals, which I think Mr. Chidambaram is uniquely placed to understand these things. He actually has a very good understanding of the telecom sector. He has actually been a telecom lawyer himself. So I do hope that he will recognize these nuances and work towards not killing the golden goose.
Also perhaps facing the heat in that same sector of telecom. I can see Mr. Piyush Goyal smiling already. So we're not sure if that's proving to be an advantage or a disadvantage. But Sanjeev, a quick word from you on the kind of optimism that seems to be building up, and we'll go sector by sector. We've seen Mr. Sumant Sinha talk about power in particular. We've seen the telecom industry's views. Do you think there is some sort of a magic wand he has to fix it all?
Well, he has to conjure up one if he doesn't have one. That's the challenge he has, and according to Mr. Uppal, the one great advantage that he has is that because he has represented most sectors as a lawyer, so he has a deep understanding of all those sectors. I don't think that's, here is a man who comes with a great baggage of expectations. Right. Here is a man...
Which is a worry also.
No, yes, but that's the truth also,
right,
that he comes with carrying a big baggage of expectations, and he also comes as a great enthusiast for this job.
Absolutely.
For the last 3 years when he was not there, everybody and his uncle knew that Mr. Chidambaram wants to come back here. Yeah, and for all the, and so the thing is, so here is a man who is eminently qualified. He has presented some of the best, most dream budgets. He is the darling of the markets. He's the darling of everybody who believes in the markets, in industrial growth, economic activity. So he's a favorite. The
Vivek,
big
in fact,
question
if
is,
I could ask you to compare him with Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, because Mr. Pranab Mukherjee perhaps did not quite become the